The Greensboro Massacre is the term for an event which took place on November 3, 1979, in Greensboro, North Carolina. 5 protesters, including 4 members of the Communist Workers' Party, CWP, were killed by members of the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party, ANP, during a Death to the Klan march organized by the CWP. The event had been preceded by inflammatory rhetoric from both sides. The CWP had originally come to Greensboro to support workers' rights activism among mostly black textile industry workers in the area. The march was a part of that larger effort. The Greensboro City Police Department had an informant within the KKK and ANP group who notified them that the Klan was prepared for armed violence. As the two opposing groups came in contact, at the onset of the march, both sides exchanged gunfire. The CWP and supporters had 1 or more handguns, while members of the KKK and the ANP were shown in a video taking rifles from their cars. In addition to the 5 deaths, 10 demonstrators and a Klansman were wounded. 2 criminal trials of several Klan and ANP members were conducted by state and federal prosecutors. In the first trial, conducted by the state, 5 were charged with first-degree murder and felony riot. All were acquitted by a jury that concluded that the defendants acted in self-defense. A second, federal criminal civil rights trial in 1984 was brought against 9 defendants. The trial resulted in an acquittal of all defendants, when the jury concluded that the men had acted based on political, rather than racial, motivations. In 1980, surviving protesters filed a separate civil suit, led by the Christic Institute, against 87 defendants, seeking damages of $48 million. Defendants included the City of Greensboro, State of North Carolina, the Justice Department, and the FBI. The suit alleged civil rights violations, failure to protect demonstrators, and wrongful death. 8 defendants were found liable for the wrongful death of the 1 protester who was not a member of the CWP. The city settled with the plaintiffs for $351,000. In 2004, 25 years after the event, a private organization formed the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission, modeled after commissions in South Africa, Canada, and elsewhere with the intention to investigate the events of 1979. The private organization failed to secure authority or local sanction, when the mayor and most of the city council voted against endorsing the undertaking. The commission lacked both subpoena power to compel testimony and the ability to invoke perjury for false testimony. When it issued its final report, the commission concluded that both sides had engaged in inflammatory rhetoric, but the Klan and ANP members had intended to inflict injury on protesters, and the police department had colluded with the Klan by allowing anticipated violence to take place. In 2009, the Greensboro City Council passed a resolution expressing regret for the deaths in the march. In 2015, the city unveiled a marker to memorialize the Greensboro Massacre. 300 people attended the ceremony. On August 15, 2017 and on October 6, 2020, the Greensboro City Council formally apologized for the massacre. The Communist Workers' Party, CWP, had its origin in 1973 in New York as a splinter group of the Communist Party USA. The CWP was one of several groups established as part of a Maoist revival within the radical community. To the Maoists, the pro-Soviet Communist Party USA was deemed to be soft on capitalism and lacking in militancy. Its leaders intended to increase activism in what they called the Workers' Viewpoint Organization, WVO, along the Maoist model. In 1979, members of the CWP came to North Carolina in an attempt to organize textile workers. In the South, the Communists had achieved little success with white workers, so they shifted much of their attention to black textile workers, who had long been excluded from these positions in previous decades. As a result of these efforts, the CWP came into conflict with a local Ku Klux Klan chapter and the American Nazi Party. Some CWP members also worked in the textile mills, including James Waller, who left his medical practice to do so. He became president of the local textile workers' union. WVO members were active in Durham and Greensboro. The WVO resisted continuing racial discrimination in North Carolina by confronting a local KKK chapter. Hostility between the groups flared in July 1979, when protesters in China Grove, North Carolina, disrupted a screening of The Birth of a Nation, a 1915 silent film by D.W. Griffith which portrayed the era of Reconstruction and the formation of the KKK in heroic terms and portrayed blacks in a demeaning, racist way. Taunts and inflammatory rhetoric were exchanged between members of the groups during the ensuing months. In October 1979, the WVO renamed itself as the Communist Workers' Organization. It planned to stage a rally and a march against the Klan on November 3, 1979, in Greensboro. The county seat of Guilford County, this city had been a site of major civil rights actions in the 1960s. Sit-ins resulted in the desegregation of lunch counters. The CWP entitled their protest as the Death to the Klan March. The event was scheduled to start in a predominantly black housing project called Morningside Homes on the black side of town, and to proceed to the Greensboro City Hall. The CWP distributed flyers that called for radical, even violent opposition to the Klan. One flyer said that the Klan should be physically beaten and chased out of town. This is the only language they understand. Armed self-defense is the only defense. Communist organizers publicly challenged the Klan to attend the march. For local TV news, camera teams arrived at the Morningside Homes at the corner of Carver and Everett Streets to cover the protest march. Members of the CWP and other anti-Klan supporters gathered to rally the march, which was planned to proceed through the city to the Greensboro City Hall. As the marchers collected, a caravan of 10 cars and a van, filled with an estimated 40 KKK and American Nazi Party members, drove back and forth in front of the housing project. Several marchers beat the cars with picket sticks or threw rocks at them. In response, the KKK and ANP members got out of their cars, took shotguns, rifles and pistols from the trunks, and fired into the crowd of protesters. Some of the latter were armed with handguns, which they fired during the brief conflict. It is not entirely clear who fired the first shot. Witnesses reported that KKK member Mark Scherer fired first, into the air. The KKK and ANP members quickly killed Caesar Koss, James Waller, and Bill Sampson at the scene. Sandra Smith was shot between the eyes as she looked out from a place where she had taken shelter. 11 others were wounded. Michael Nathan died of his wounds at the hospital 2 days later. The filmed coverage of the shootings was carried on national and international news, and the event became known as the Greensboro Massacre. Smith was black, Koss was Hispanic, and the other 3 men killed were white. Both blacks and whites were among the wounded, including one KKK member. 40 Klansmen and neo-Nazis, and several CWP marchers were said to have taken part in the shootings. The police arrested 16 Klansmen and Nazis, and several CWP members. The FBI started an investigation which it called Greenkill, Greensboro Killings, turning over evidence it gathered to the state of North Carolina for its murder trial. The state attorney prosecuted the 6 strongest criminal cases first, charging 5 Klansmen with murder: David Wayne Matthews, Jerry Paul Smith, Jack Wilson Fowler, Harold Dean Flowers, and Billy Joe Franklin. One was charged with a lesser crime. In November 1980, the jury acquitted all the defendants, finding that they had acted in self-defense. Residents of Morningside Homes, the housing development where the violence occurred, and students at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, A&T, expressed shock and anger over the verdict and a feeling of hopelessness regarding the judicial system and the Ku Klux Klan. The Department of Justice through the FBI had an extensive criminal investigation underway. After the acquittals in 1980, the FBI reopened its investigation in preparation for a federal prosecution. Based on additional evidence, a federal grand jury indicted 9 men on civil rights charges in 1983. The case brought by the U.S. Attorney charged the Klansmen and Nazis with racially motivated violence, and with interference in a racially integrated event. 3 men were charged with violating the civil rights of the 5 victims. The defendants were David Wayne Matthews, Jerry Paul Smith and Jack Wilson Fowler, who had been prosecuted and acquitted in the state criminal trial. 6 other men were charged with conspiracy to violate the demonstrators' civil rights: Virgil Lee Griffin, Sr., Eddie Dawson, also a police informant, Roland Wayne Wood, Roy Clinton Toney, Coleman Blair Pridmore, and Rayford Milano Cottle. On April 15, 1984, all 9 defendants were acquitted. The jury rejected the government's argument that the defendants were motivated in the shootings by racial hatred. The CWP believed that the indictment was drawn too narrowly, giving the defense an opportunity to argue that political opposition to communism and patriotic fervor, rather than racial motivations, prompted the confrontation. Neither trial investigated the actions of federal agents or the Greensboro police. In 1980, survivors filed a civil suit in federal district court seeking $48 million in damages. The Christic Institute led the legal effort. The complaint alleged that law enforcement officials knew that Klansmen and Nazis would use violence to disrupt the demonstration by communist labor organizers and black residents of Greensboro, but deliberately failed to protect them. 4 federal agents were named as defendants in the suit, in addition to 36 Greensboro police and municipal officials, and 20 Klansmen and members of the American Nazi Party. Among the federal defendants was Bernard Butkovich of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, who had worked as an undercover agent in 1979 and infiltrated one of the American Nazi Party chapters about 3 months before the protest. He testified that a Klansman had referred in a planning meeting to using pipe bombs for possible assaults at the rally, and that he took no further action. The Christic legal team was led by attorneys Louis Pitts and Daniel Sheehan, together with People's Law Office attorney G. Flint Taylor and attorney Carolyn McAllister of Durham, North Carolina. A federal jury in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, found 2 Klansmen, 3 Nazis, 2 Greensboro police officers, and a police informant liable for the wrongful death of Dr. Michael Nathan, a non-CWP demonstrator, and for injuries to survivors Paul Bermanzan and Tom Clark, who had been wounded. It awarded 2 survivors with a $350,000 judgment against the city, the Ku Klux Klan, and the American Nazi Party for violating the civil rights of the demonstrators. The widow Dr. Marty Nathan was paid by the city in order to cover damages caused by the KKK and ANP as well. She chose to donate some money to grassroots efforts for social justice and education.